You have been carrying a weight that was never meant for you. If you are here, it is likely because you have spent months, maybe years, trying to figure out why something that should have felt safe instead left you feeling drained, confused, and constantly on edge. You have replayed conversations in your head, wondering what you said wrong, where you crossed a line, or why your effort never seemed to be enough. You have adjusted yourself, softened your voice, changed your routines, and held back your truth just to keep the peace. And still, the ground kept shifting beneath you. The exhaustion you feel is real. The confusion you carry is real. But the most important truth you need to hear right now is this: you were not the problem. You were not too sensitive. You were not too demanding. You were not the cause of the instability. You were responding to a dynamic that was designed to keep you off balance, and recognizing that is the first step toward reclaiming your clarity. When you are involved with a woman who operates from a place of emotional manipulation, the relationship rarely looks like obvious cruelty. Instead, it looks like a series of subtle adjustments, quiet expectations, and unspoken rules that you are expected to follow without being told. The core psychological mechanism at play here is control through emotional unpredictability. It is not always driven by malice. Often, it is driven by a deep fear of vulnerability, a need to manage how others perceive her, and a pattern of using external regulation to manage internal discomfort. When someone cannot sit with their own uncertainty, they create an environment where they hold the emotional compass. You become the anchor they lean on, but also the target they blame when the storm returns. This is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of a system that prioritizes stability for one person at the expense of everyone else. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior, but it removes the illusion that you could have fixed it by trying harder. You cannot love someone out of a pattern they are committed to maintaining. The first pattern you likely noticed is the shifting of expectations. What worked yesterday suddenly becomes a mistake today. A tone you used, a boundary you set, a decision you made, all of it can be rewritten in hindsight to place you in the wrong. This happens because emotional control thrives on ambiguity. When rules are clear, people can meet them. When rules are fluid, the person who holds the power gets to decide what counts as compliance and what counts as failure. Psychologically, this is often rooted in projection and externalized responsibility. Uncomfortable feelings, mistakes, or insecurities are not processed internally. They are assigned to the nearest available person, usually the one who cares the most about keeping the connection intact. For you, this meant walking through your own life, second-guessing your memory, your reactions, your intentions. You began to monitor your words before you spoke them. You started apologizing for things that were not yours to carry. Over time, this erodes your sense of reality. You stop trusting your own judgment because you have been trained to believe that your judgment is the source of the problem. The truth is simpler. Your judgment was working exactly as it should. The environment was not designed to support it. When you are consistently told that your perception is flawed, you begin to outsource your reality to the person creating the confusion. That is how emotional imbalance takes root. It does not require force. It only requires repetition. And repetition breeds doubt. The moment you stop doubting your own experience is the moment the system begins to lose its grip. You do not need to win every conversation. You only need to stop treating your own instincts as unreliable. The second pattern is the cycle of closeness and withdrawal. There are moments when everything feels aligned, when her attention is focused on you, when you feel seen, valued, and relieved. Then, without clear warning, the temperature drops. Conversations become short. Effort feels one-sided. You are left wondering what changed, what you missed, what you need to do to bring the warmth back. This push and pull is not random. It is a method of emotional regulation through intermittent reinforcement. When affection and approval are given unpredictably, the brain treats them like a scarce resource. You invest more energy trying to secure them because the uncertainty creates a psychological pull that is hard to resist. At its core, this pattern often stems from a fear of sustained intimacy. True closeness requires mutual vulnerability, consistent presence, and the willingness to be seen without performance. For someone who relies on control to feel safe, that level of openness feels threatening, so the connection is pulled back, just as it deepens. For you, this created a cycle of chasing, adjusting, and exhausting yourself, trying to maintain a balance that was never meant to be steady. You learned to read microsignals, to anticipate shifts, to manage your own needs so they would not disrupt the fragile rhythm. That is not love. That is emotional labor disguised as devotion. And it leaves you feeling hollow, because you were giving your energy to a system that only returns it on its own terms. When affection becomes conditional, it stops being connection and starts being leverage. Recognizing this does not mean you were foolish for hoping it would stabilize. It means you were operating under normal assumptions in an abnormal environment. Healthy relationships do not require you to earn basic respect through constant adjustment. They thrive on predictability, mutual care, and the freedom to be imperfect without fear of emotional withdrawal. The third pattern is the gradual erosion of boundaries. It rarely starts with a dramatic demand. It begins with small concessions. A request framed as a favor, a comment framed as concern, a reaction framed as disappointment. You comply because you care, because you want to show flexibility, because you believe that compromise is part of a healthy relationship. But compliance in this dynamic is not met with mutual adjustment. It is met with expectation. Each small concession becomes the new baseline. Each boundary you set is treated as a negotiation that can be reopened. Psychologically, this happens because rigid boundaries are perceived as threats to control. When someone relies on emotional leverage to maintain stability, a clear no disrupts the entire structure. The response is often subtle punishment, silence, guilt, criticism, or the quiet suggestion that your needs are excessive. Over time, you stop setting boundaries altogether because the cost feels too high. You begin to shrink your life to fit inside a space that keeps getting smaller. The impact is a quiet loss of autonomy. You stop voicing preferences. You stop protecting your time. You stop trusting your own limits because you have been conditioned to believe that limits are selfish. They are not. Limits are the foundation of respect. When they are consistently overridden, it is not a sign of passion or commitment. It is a sign of imbalance. You cannot maintain a sense of self when every line you draw is treated as a temporary suggestion. Boundary erosion is not about the requests themselves. It is about the expectation that your compliance is guaranteed. When you realize that your yes should be a choice and not an obligation, the entire dynamic shifts. You begin to see that flexibility without reciprocity is not generosity. It is self-abandonment. Recognizing these patterns is not about assigning blame. It is about restoring your perspective. When you step back and look at the dynamic as a whole, you begin to see that the confusion you experienced was not accidental. It was functional. It served a purpose within the system. That realization does not make the pain disappear, but it removes the question of what you could have done differently. You were not failing at the relationship. You were succeeding at surviving it. And survival is not the same as living. The shift from confusion to clarity begins when you stop measuring your worth by how well you adapt to someone else's instability. You start measuring it by how honestly you honor your own reality. This is where awareness turns into action. Awareness means noticing when your body tenses before you speak. It means recognizing when you are editing yourself to avoid a reaction. It means understanding that peace should not feel like walking on a tightrope. Clarity comes when you accept that you cannot control how someone else processes their emotions, but you can control how you respond to them. You can stop treating every shift as your responsibility to fix. You can stop absorbing emotions that were never yours to carry. You can begin to separate your sense of safety from someone else's mood. That separation is not coldness. It is self-preservation. When you stop internalizing reactions that belong to someone else, you create mental space. In that space, you can finally hear your own thoughts. You can finally trust your own instincts. You can finally stop asking for validation from a source that is designed to withhold it. Awareness is not a single moment. It is a steady accumulation of small truths that eventually become too clear to ignore. Staying strong in this context does not mean becoming hardened. It means becoming steady. Strength here is quiet. It is the decision to speak clearly even when your voice shakes. It is the choice to follow through on a limit even when it triggers discomfort. It is the willingness to sit with the temporary friction of saying no, knowing that the long-term cost of saying yes is far greater. Setting limits with someone who operates from control requires consistency, not intensity. You do not need to argue your boundaries into existence. You only need to state them, hold them, and let your actions reflect them. When a boundary is met with resistance, you do not escalate. You do not justify. You do not over-explain. You simply repeat the limit, adjust your distance if necessary, and allow the natural consequences to unfold. This is where calm detachment becomes your most practical tool. Detachment is not indifference. It is emotional clarity. It means you can observe a reaction without absorbing it. You can hear a criticism without internalizing it. You can recognize a manipulation attempt without feeling compelled to respond to it. Detachment creates space. In that space, you regain the ability to choose rather than react. You stop treating every interaction as a test you must pass. You start treating it as information you can use to decide what level of engagement is healthy for you. When you detach, you stop feeding the cycle. You stop providing the emotional fuel that keeps the instability alive. You simply step back and let the reality of the situation stand on its own. That is not cruelty. That is honesty. And honesty, even when it is quiet, is the most reliable foundation for change. Self-respect returns when your actions align with your values, even when it is uncomfortable. It returns when you stop negotiating your dignity for the sake of temporary peace. It returns when you accept that someone else's inability to accept your boundaries is not a reflection of the boundaries being wrong. It is a reflection of their relationship to control. You will likely face moments where your commitment to your limits is tested. There will be guilt, there will be pressure, there will be attempts to pull you back into old patterns. In those moments, remember that consistency is the only language that breaks the cycle. If you enforce a limit and then withdraw it the next time it becomes inconvenient, you teach the system that persistence works. If you state a boundary and then abandon it to avoid discomfort, you teach yourself that your needs are optional. Neither serves your healing. What serves your healing is the quiet, repeated practice of choosing yourself. Not dramatically, not aggressively, simply and steadily. You do not need to announce your growth. You only need to live it. When you stop trying to prove your worth to someone who benefits from your doubt, you free yourself from the need to perform. You begin to operate from a place of internal alignment rather than external validation. That alignment does not require permission. It only requires practice. Each time you honor a limit, you rebuild trust with yourself. Each time you refuse to participate in confusion, you strengthen your mental clarity. Each time you choose calm over reaction, you prove to yourself that you are no longer controlled by someone else's emotional weather. Self-respect is not a feeling you wait for. It is a decision you make daily. And it is the only foundation that cannot be shaken by someone else's instability. As you move through this process, you will notice that the heavy fog of confusion begins to lift. It does not happen overnight. It happens through small, repeated moments of clarity. A conversation where you do not apologize for existing. A decision where you trust your own timeline. A boundary that you hold even when it feels uncomfortable. Each one rewires the belief that you must earn your place through compliance. You begin to see that healthy connection does not require you to abandon yourself. It requires mutual respect, clear communication, and the willingness to navigate conflict without punishment. When that is missing, distance is not a failure. It is an adjustment. You are not walking away because you gave up. You are stepping back because you finally understand what you were stepping into. That understanding is the foundation of real peace. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of clarity. It is knowing what you will no longer tolerate, knowing why you made that choice, and knowing that you have the right to protect your energy without guilt. You do not need closure from the person who created the confusion. You only need to stop feeding the confusion with your attention. Closure is not a conversation. It is a decision. It is the moment you stop waiting for them to understand and start living in a way that no longer requires it. When you make that decision, the weight begins to lift. The exhaustion begins to fade. The constant monitoring begins to stop. You finally get to rest. And rest, after years of emotional labor, is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Healing in this space is not about erasing the past. It is about integrating what you learned so you do not repeat it. You will carry lessons about your patterns, your triggers, your willingness to overcompensate. Those lessons are valuable. They show you where you need to rebuild trust with yourself. Trust returns when you keep small promises to your own well-being. It returns when you stop treating your exhaustion as a sign of love. It returns when you recognize that your voice matters, even when it is not being validated. You do not need permission to protect your peace. You do not need consensus to set a limit. You only need the quiet certainty that you deserve a life where you are not constantly managing someone else's emotional weather. That certainty grows stronger each time you choose it. It grows stronger when you stop looking for closure from the person who created the confusion and start creating it for yourself through consistent action. Moving forward does not mean becoming cynical. It means becoming clear. You can still believe in love, in connection, in mutual effort, but you will no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You will recognize that real safety does not feel like walking on glass. It feels like breathing. It feels like knowing you can say no and still be respected. It feels like knowing your boundaries are not obstacles to overcome, but foundations to build on. The strength you develop through this process is quiet, but it is unshakable. It does not rely on winning arguments. It relies on honoring truth. It does not rely on changing someone else. It relies on staying aligned with yourself. And when you stay aligned,